Okay, so today I'm going to be going over what I learned from the assessment methods PDF and just what I found important from that and valuable from that. So I wanted to start with an overview of the lesson. So we will first be going over the 3 keys to quality assessment, the process of effective assessment, the 4 categories of assessment methods, some misconceptions of assessment methods, the target method match, and then lastly, the 5 stages of the assessment development cycle. So let's dive in to the 3 keys to assessment quality. So these 3 keys, found on page 89, are just really to know whether we intend to use assessment results to promote learning or to see if learning has occurred. So we have to kind of make that distinction before we can really start shaping our assessment. The second key is to design assessments to reflect the variety of achievement targets that coincide with standards, and some of those are listed there on the slide. And then the third one is to know how to design assessments to cover our targets and serve our purposes. This is important for any effective thing in the classroom in general, to know our plan and know what we need to cover and know what we're composing needs to serve. So let's look at this process of effective assessment. And this is really in detail on page 90, but I kind of wanted to go through my interpretation of this flow chart. So in thinking about why we assess, we're asking questions like the purpose of our assessment and, who is using these results. And thinking about what we're assessing, we're asking questions about what learning targets are we assessing? Are these clear? Are they good? Is this a good assessment? Then those come in together, and thinking about, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to achieve our purpose, and how are we going to achieve these learning targets? So we think about what method, which we'll dive into in just a second, and then how do we sample, and really how do we avoid bias? And then lastly, in our process of effective assessment, we're looking at how do we communicate. So questions we'll ask here is, how do we manage information? How are we going to report this information? And I think it's really important to think about how this article talked about including students in each of these aspects of the process. And this to me is so important because I think that granting student autonomy in each of these stages of the process just allows for better classroom assessment and really better relationships with our students, especially in how we assess and recognizing which methods are going to just highlight our students' knowledge, and then also how we communicate to them, because I think oftentimes as teachers we don't communicate as effectively as we should as in terms of assessment results. And so I think it's important to keep the students in mind, especially there as well. So now moving on to our 4 categories of assessment methods. So I just kind of want to throw these out there and then we can dive into each one specifically. So first, we're looking at selective response and short answer. Second, we'll look at extended written response. Third, performance assessment. And fourth, personal communication. So diving into our selected response and short answer, this is in detail on page 91 in case you have any questions here. So our examples are multiple choice, true, false, matching, short answer, fill in the blank. All things that we're very familiar with. Now it's just categorized for us in correct language. So our student scores with selected response and short answer are figured as the number or proportion of questions answered correctly. I provided an example of a multiple choice selected response that we would be familiar with, just to kind of put some visual to this information. So moving into the second category, extended written response. So this is where students are going to compose a written answer to a question or task opposed to selecting from a list. So this is coming instead of us providing them options, they are going to compose their own answer. It is at least several sentences in length, and some examples would be like comparing works of literature, analyzing a scientific problem, solving a math equation and explaining all your work, or describing something in detail across all curriculum. We score here by either giving points for specific pieces of information being present or in the form of a rubric. So there's a little bit of a binary there as far as how we score. I did an example of a math example of written response because I think we generally think of written response in terms of literature and reading or like a science explanation, but this can also be used in math. So in math, we see this where, like in this example, the students would solve this math problem, show all their work, and then explain their steps. So this would be an example of a written response in math. So moving into performance assessment. So I think this assessment is really cool in the classroom, especially because I think it's not what we generally think of. I think assessment kind of connotes this idea of like a written test. And so performance assessment was something I really enjoyed reading about. So this is based on observing and judging quality of a performance of product. So some examples would be playing a musical instrument as pictured here, speaking a foreign language, which I'm sure is, a little intimidating, but still a great way to assess how a student is understanding a foreign language, working productively in a group, and then writing a term paper, lab report, work of art. That's kind of goes into how the quality of the product would be important. So here again, though, students are scored through either points awarded for present features or through a rubric. So one performance assessment example I really enjoyed was the working productively in a group. I think that's something that we're really doing in this course. And so I know that we are definitely being assessed on that through our group project. So the fourth and last category is personal communication. This is one that I really love just because I am such a communicator, and so I know I'm really going to utilize this in my classroom. So we find out what students have learned through interacting with them. So whether this is looking at and responding to students' comments, asking questions, interviewing students in conferences, oral exams, all those are great examples of this category. I really, being an English-focused secondary ed major, I love the concept of interviewing students in conferences. I think this is a really cool way to get perspective on books and really understand where they are, and even like writing a paper, for example. So student answers can be long or and complex, or they can be short. And then we evaluate the quality of these responses through using a rubric or scoring guide. And this is something I think is really important in personal communication because personal communication can be so subjective. I really like this point that the article made about evaluating based on a rubric or scoring guide, so students, do feel that there's just a place of like equality and scoring, and so they feel like the personal communication is more attainable to do well on. So I've included on page 94, the article discussed some misconceptions as far as assessment. So I included some of those because these were definitely some that called me out in my thinking. So you got to think about that none of the methods are more authentic than the other or more superior if all of them are used well. Each assessment method can include student involvement, not just performance assessment, which is good to think about that students can be involved in assessment, even if that means that they, get to help shape like a multiple choice question or something even. The third one is about portfolios, and then the fourth is how presentation, group project worksheets, posters, things such as this, which we tend to give their own category, actually fall under these four categories. So those are some of those highlighted there. So the target method match was pivotal in this article, and this is such an important part of what we learned here. So I really enjoyed this chart. I think it's kind of something I'm going to print out and have in my binder for teaching one day. And thinking about our four categories and how these fit in our learning targets. So one, obviously this is on here and we can all go through this ourselves, but I kind of wanted to highlight some things that were surprising to me through the article and things that I thought stood out. So I thought that our knowledge mastery in terms of performance assessment not working well was something I hadn't really thought about before, because I think that it's easy to think that a performance assessment will show us everything that students have learned, but as we learned through the article, this does take too much time, and that students have too much knowledge to really show through just one performance task. Another thing that I really thought was interesting is that the ability to create products is not a good match for personal communication. And I guess this is kind of common sense in thinking about, well, a student can't just tell me they can do something, they've got to show it to me. But I think oftentimes teachers may not take the time to have students show them how to create something, and they just kind of want to breeze over it through students writing a response or just telling them they can. But it is important to take that time to do a full performance assessment here. The last thing I kind of want to highlight on this chart, obviously there is so much here, but I thought that the selected response in terms of reasoning proficiency was interesting, in that it's a good match only for assessing understanding of some patterns of reasoning. So I think that selected response is great, but it has its limitations. And I think that a selected response is oftentimes overused in the classroom, especially with reasoning. And I think that reasoning, it breaches past, just multiple choice or matching. And I think that oftentimes teachers don't take the time to allow for that expansion in their assessment. So I thought that this chart was pivotal and super important in understanding all of this. And those were just some things that this article really highlighted for me, and some things that this article really challenged in my thinking about target method matching. So there is that really helpful chart. So the last thing I really want to dive into is this assessment development cycle. So there are five stages in this cycle, and it's planning, developing, critiquing, administering, and revising. So I want to dive into each of these individually, because this was such a big chunk of this article, and really look at how this cycle plays out in the classroom. So 1, planning the assessment. So the first kind of vocabulary term I think it's important for us to know is validity problem. So this is when the assessment does not measure what we intend for it to. I think this oftentimes happens in the classroom. So the first step in planning is to list our major targets. Second, identify the sub-targets. Third, classify these targets or sub-targets. And then 4, write the unpacked and or clarified learning targets into the appropriate spaces in the test plan format that I select. So this is all found on page 111, and most of this is pulled directly from that page. So if there are any questions here, the page 111 is a great place to go. So I kind of pull top of one of the charts to kind of see this planning stage in action. So the learning target is where we set our target. We classify that into the target type, as discussed earlier. We determine a assessment method based on that chart I just went over for the target match, and then we deem an importance for that. So moving on to the second part of planning the assessment, how to assess how important an aspect of assessment is in planning. So these are kind of 3 steps that the article really went through on page 113. So we need to understand the breadth and depth of each learning target, analyze the value of each learning target, and keep state standards and local curriculum in mind, which I know is sometimes tough when we as teachers have all these ideas, but state standards and local curriculum do play such a pivotal role in assessment. So I think it's important for us to keep those in mind. All right, so now moving into the second stage, which is developing the assessment. So in this stage, we need to make sure to follow guidelines in development of both exercises, questions, or tasks, and have a sound method of scoring. I think a sound method of scoring is really important here, because I know oftentimes for me, I'll develop my assessment, then really not think about how I'm going to score it. So that this development is twofold, in that we have to have this sound method of scoring. Kind of transitioning into our third stage, we need to ensure to include the following stage to eliminate potential sources of distortion or bias, which are very possible to arise during this developmental step. So this third stage is critique of our assessment through recognizing barriers. So before I even dive into these barriers here, I think it's important for us to critique our assessments because we have to recognize that we as teachers are going to make mistakes. And as easy as it is to kind of skip the critique and just dive into administering the assessment, I think this extra time is worth it because these barriers are real, and these barriers really can hinder student success. So here I've listed some barriers. Student barriers